So much of my work over the years has been around helping people heal from trauma. And one of the things that psychologists and therapists focus on is helping people develop resilience. But what happens when our understanding of resilience actually creates more harm and keeps us stuck? That's what I'm going to be unpacking today with author Soraya Chemaly, who wrote a new book called The Resilience Myth: New Thinking on Grit, Strength, and Growth After Trauma. It's time to get naked with Dr. Kate. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a Beverly Hills-based psychologist, certified sex therapist, and the founder of Modern Intimacy, a national therapy group. So let's dive into all things sex, relationships, mental health, and answer your questions with practical solutions and real answers. Each week, I'll share insights to help you build a healthy relationship with yourself, with other people, and with your sexuality. It's time to start thriving authentically. So let's get naked. And if you like this podcast, hit the download button so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to leave 5 stars and a review. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've been really excited to speak with you about resilience and all of the ways that it can be really misconstrued and can actually be something that works against us. But before we jump in, I'd love to hear a little bit about what prompted you to write this book. How did you get here?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. I'm really, really excited to talk to you. So two things prompted me to write this book. I had written a book about anger and the social construction, uses, and misuses of that emotion. And what was so striking to me in the process of writing that, and also just honestly years of writing as a feminist, was the utter lack of social care
Yes.
for what so many people need, and in particular, what so many women of all types of identities really say they need. And so I went from the idea that anger is a signal emotion, that it's telling us something's wrong, that it's a very social emotion because we have to say to other people, usually, I need something, I'm identifying a problem, can you help me? And so when
Mhm.
we shut down anger, we shut down the ability to do that. And
Mm.
so there was this overriding just impression of carelessness. And so the next book that I wanted to write, which I was in discussions about just before COVID hit, was about that. It was about care,
Mm.
the value of care, why we don't value care. And then COVID hit.
Mm.
And my editor and I were talking, and she was really focused on trauma. And
Mm.
I felt very clear, I felt a very strong feeling that her thoughts about trauma were actually what I was saying about care. So much of what we were thinking about as traumatic was actually carelessness, causing people to experience terrible hardship and adversity. And so when COVID hit, we wouldn't all be traumatized equally by the fact of a global pandemic. Some people would just suffer inordinately because they lived in sacrifice zones or they were
Mm.
so-called heroes. And so those two things dovetailed. And I started focusing on what that meant. And what I came to was that the social response to the carelessness is buck up, be
Yeah.
resilient. You can develop these skills, you can learn these habits of mind, you can develop mental toughness. And that is not a solution. It's a deflection that just kind of doubles down on status quo power. And so the book
Mhm.
is really, as I say, about resilience as an ideology. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a journalist, I'm a researcher. And what I wanted to see was what happens when the idea of resilience proliferates in the
Mhm.
culture, detached from even the science of it, right?
Mhm.
Detached from what we think of the science of it and
Mhm.
becomes lodged in our cultural imagination.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was really
you
long.
no, it was beautiful. And I think you accomplished that in spades in your book because you talk a lot about some of the biggest ideas about resilience. And what I so appreciated was how you did bring in the science and also, and maybe this is my biased opinion, but you showcase sort of the bias even in the science and how the science gets it wrong. And I thought that
Right.
was so brilliantly stated because as a practitioner and a provider, one of the things that I know a lot about resilience is that people are clamoring for it.
Yes.
They want it. It's survival. It helps
Hmm.
them heal. And also when they're so organized around getting it in a certain way or defining it in a certain way, it
Hmm.
can be part of what holds them back in their healing. And I think you really showcase that well
Well,
in your
thank you.
writing.
You know,
Yeah.
what was so striking to me, I love science. Like I am just, I could spend my entire day just reading research. It's
Mm.
just the kind of brain that I have, right?
Mhm.
But the fact is that, in fact, there's an entire chapter in the book about narrative strength, right?
Mhm.
What we think of as narrative, and this is not new, but what I'm clearly saying is even our science is a form of narrative
Mhm.
because we come to science framing questions, deciding what will be included, who will be included, how it will
Yes.
be included. And if we don't take all of that into consideration, we are missing valuable insights, which I think is pretty clear. I mean, you know, right now there's this whole explosion of really understanding that medical research was mainly conducted on straight white guys for like 80 years, you
Forever.
know, forever.
Yeah.
And that's a problem for the rest of us.
Mhm.
And that's a perfect example because even
Mhm.
yesterday I was looking, there was some article in the news and it said what a 100-year study proves about happiness. And I knew exactly what study it was. It was, I think it was the study of of a group of men from Harvard over the course of their lifetimes. And I was like, seriously, are you going to universalize the experiences of that group of people, that very small group of people, and extrapolate
Yeah.
for the rest of the world, which is what
Yeah.
happens when you
Yes.
leap from science to media, right?
Absolutely. I want to read a quote from your book that I think really speaks to this. You said, optimism, bias, and positivity intensify abuse and exacerbate women's risks. Empathy, hope, acceptance, and resilience research of a 2020 meta analysis of the relationship to positive psychology and domestic violence concluded refraining to leave abusive
Mm-hmm.
relationships and forgiveness
Mm-hmm.
actually increases the likelihood of further transgressions. So,
Right.
gender expectations, optimism, sacrifice, and forgiveness of normalized and religious communities are now feeling a right wing push to bring a legal end to no fault
That's
divorces and
right.
legal reform, which resulted in massive declines in rates of suicide among women, intimate partner violence, and spousal homicide. So, this is a great example of how some of the research that we have about resilience really only follows specific groups of people and then gets normalized broadly, and these vulnerable
That's
populations
right.
really suffer. So, can you say a little bit more about some of what you found in that regard?
Yes, you know, I it's so funny. I love the science of optimism because
Mm-hmm.
it taught us a lot, right? It taught us a lot about depression. It taught us a lot about self-efficacy. That's all valid. However, as you
Mm-hmm.
just said, it is the slide from one sector, one category, one context into another with zero limits, right? And what people
Mm-hmm.
end up doing is saying, particularly in the United States, right? We are the nation most associated with optimism, with looking
Interesting.
forward, right? It's a cultural attribute. It's a national virtue to be optimistic, to
Mm-hmm.
look on the bright side, to think you are going to succeed no matter the odds.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, when you do that, you have a distorted risk assessment. And for particularly women in situations of vulnerability and intimate partner violence, assessing risk is how you save your life. It's how you
Mm-hmm.
save your children's lives, right? And so what often happens is well-meaning people thinking positive thinking is really helpful when
Yeah.
you're in a situation of hardship will say things like, you're strong, you
Yeah.
can do it. Do it for the children. He's really a nice person. And if you just love him enough, he can change. Like these
Right.
are words people say, right? And particularly in religious um, communities,
Mm-hmm.
women are really expected to forgive and forget and to do that emotional labor. And
Oh,
as
good.
these studies show,
Mm-hmm.
it really puts them at risks. It leaves them, first of all, bereft of support
Mm-hmm.
because you say this to them and it shuts down their ability to say, I need to get out, I need help, can you let me live at your house, can you lend me some money, can I borrow your car? So it's very isolating in addition.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think it really follows this belief system that, and you highlight this in your book really beautifully too, that when we are in situations that feel hopeless or powerless, often we will respond with an opposite way of thinking.
Hmm.
So we'll try to assume we have more agency, more
Right.
control,
We'll
more
overcorrect.
power. Yeah. And I think that, the idea of resilience often has people bouncing in that overcorrection. Okay, well,
Hmm.
this feels untenable, so I'll focus on what I can control and really snowball in that area. And sometimes
Hmm.
there is some effectiveness in
There is
saying, okay,
effectiveness in that.
yeah, I can fake it till I make it. It's great.
Hmm.
But there becomes a dangerous part where that stops being effective. And I wonder if you can speak to that.
Well, I think what happens, well, first of all, I agree with you. Self-efficacy is important. Like
Yeah,
feeling that you have, like when, I'll use COVID again. When COVID happened, it was very clear that very little was in anybody's personal control.
right.
And so what many of us did was withdraw into our private spaces
Hmm.
and try and, again, control what we could. Our food, our hygiene habits changed, our
Hmm.
relationships changed. Like that was a way to effect some limited amount of personal efficacy and not to dampen anxiety, right? Like I
Hmm.
can manage this realm. But
Hmm.
in fact, very few of us have the kind of control that makes societal change that is systemic and that would
Hmm.
alter the parameters of the risk to begin with, right? And that's the danger. Like telling people to turn inward, inward, inward all the time ends up meaning that the result is a kind of tunnel vision
Yeah,
in which not only do we stop looking at context, stop considering relationships and politics, but we don't expect anything.
right.
We stop believing that we deserve help, that we should help each other. And that needs some balance. And what was
Hmm.
really striking to me when I started was I looked at possibly every published English language newspaper article, media headline that said how to be resilient, 10 ways to be resilient, 5 ways to be resilient. And there was always a list. And in that list, one item would say something like find a community,
Hmm.
make friendships, have social support. And in fact, even that bullet point, even that bullet point was somewhat transactional because it would always
Hmm.
suggest that when you need help, it will be there. So
Hmm.
make the friends so you can get the help. The other items all had to do with mindset or physical exercise or, you know, one person's ability to do something. And I think you might agree with me. This is a conclusion I came to. The that order, that
Hmm.
proportionality is completely inverted,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like we need the 9/10ths to be focused on
On community.
relationships, community,
Yeah,
mutual care, solidarity,
yeah.
valuing the care people are providing,
Hmm.
providing care, sharing resources. And then at the end, it might say, it's really great if you can try and maintain a positive mindset,
Right.
have cognitive flexibility, and meditate.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's so much focus on individualism in our
Yes.
culture. And I think it really creates this emphasis. And again, you spoke to this in your book that if you're not doing it yourself in this
Hmm.
contained way, that somehow that's part of the problem. And
Right.
folks just don't have the ability to do it, whatever that it is in the healing alone. And
Right.
you have a quote in your book that just really, it stuck with me. It said, "We are nurtured in the spaces we nurture." And that, if I had to sum your book up in one phrase, it would be that.
Hmm.
Because so much of what we understand about resilience is meant, or I shouldn't say is meant to, but people interpret it as being meant to happen in these sort of dark spaces of pain. I have to go over
Yes.
here and journal by myself. I have to go
That's
to
right.
therapy by myself, which is relational, but it's still you and one other
Yes.
human. And what we know about how so many people heal, especially when we're talking about healing from addiction or healing from serious trauma, the answer is in community, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right. And
these are.
also, so much of what you're describing, even if you're experiencing it as an individual,
Mhm,
it's often tied to intergenerational and historical
mhm,
trauma. It's
mhm,
tied to living in a post slavery society. It's tied to migration. It's tied to again, things that as an individual you cannot possibly hope to overcome or transcend
Mhm.
just by yourself. And
Mhm.
so I think too that that model of individual health and wellness
Mhm.
has a place, but has its limits,
It
you know?
does. Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time in the book talking about limits and our limitlessness, the belief
Mm.
that there are no limits, right? And that
Right.
we can just grow endlessly. And I think it's pretty corrosive to healing, to transcending whatever the particular circumstances or event might be.
Mhm.
Um, because usually trauma and adversity are limits. There's something's happening that is establishing a limit,
Yeah.
and we need to be able to cognitively and emotionally and physically deal with that.
Yeah. Well, what you're reminding, or what you're saying right now, reminds me of your chapter on bouncing back and sort of
Mm,
this illusion of we have a traumatic experience, and then to be resilient means we go back to the
mhm.
moment of thriving right before
Prior
the.
to the event.
Yeah, and I just think that's such a clever elucidation in the myth of resilience because we don't go back. We
No.
can't go back to a pre-trauma version of ourselves.
Hmm.
Healing really looks like assimilating that event into
Yes.
our narration, into the understanding of who we are and how we are in the world.
Hmm.
And I don't know if this is in the same chapter, but you know, it was a different chapter. You talked about the necessity of pessimism and how
Mm,
we do have to be willing to sit with the uncomfortable feelings. And if we are trying to bounce back and we're not willing to sort of integrate what is hard, we lose the opportunity for a lot of reflection, both for our own healing, but also to understand the systems that we're in and how we can benefit the systems and be benefited by the systems in a very crude transactional summary. But, you know, we become someone different when we
that's
heal.
exactly the point, I think.
Yeah.
What I hear a lot when I talk to people, and this was certainly true as a journalist, as a writer. I was honestly writing about very terrible things for a very long time. And I think it's a natural defense to think things have changed
Mm. Yeah.
when in fact we change,
Yeah.
right? And because we learn to think of ourselves in a kind of static selfhood,
Hmm.
there's always there's some solid me inside of this, right? And it's unchanging, or it's myself, or but
Right.
that's not the case, right? And we're constantly changing, we're constantly responding. There's just iterations upon iterations. And I think that accepting that is part of the cognitive flexibility of saying
Mm.
my circumstances are not all that changed. I changed, my relationships changed, the family
Mhm.
system changed, the nation changed. Like
Yeah.
that's what's happening.
It is. It is
Yeah.
happening every day. And it might feel really granular and insignificant as you're experiencing those shifts in the day
Hmm.
to day, you know, monotony of life. But when you look back, if we're lucky, we have significant evolution and growth.
Right.
And that really is where resilience lives, is in our ability to take in an experience, assimilate it, and reflect upon how we can evolve and change from it. And I think there's a lot of power in that and a lot of grace in that, even though it can be really hard.
Yes, it's interesting. I agree with that. And I actually think that one of the issues we're having now politically
Mm,
is tied to resilience and masculinity
I agree.
because our ideals of masculinity have not evolved, have not changed.
Yeah.
And it's such a precarious state for boys and men. And
Hmm.
so it makes sense that boys and men would hold on to something that feels solid
Mm,
and unchanging,
of course.
right? And it's interesting to me because I have a whole chapter on risk.
Hmm.
And I think of this a lot because we think of risk in such gendered ways. We think of men as the risk takers much more
Mm,
than women. But that's just if we consider risks that men experience, not risks that women experience,
right.
right?
Yes.
But secondly, I think men really struggle to take risks with masculinity,
I
to
agree.
jump into the open endedness of
Mhm.
not knowing
Mm.
what a real man is. right? Or what health,
Mhm.
like, I don't even like the phrases real man and healthy masculinity
Mhm.
because they play into the same old tropes of masculinity more broadly.
Yeah.
But I do think we have a serious problem of resilience on our hands and adaptability and change.
I agree with you. And I think that explains why so many younger men are leaning more conservatively, because
Absolutely.
historically the Conservative Party is comprised more of folks who respond to change by rooting and saying no,
Yes. Just
right?
stop standing still.
Standing still, yeah. and
Mm.
and for a lot of people, that is the way they stay safe in their
Yes.
conceptualization of the world and how they experience risk and their willingness to live in it, right? If I
Hmm.
just stay firm that change isn't happening, if I just stay rooted in tradition, all will be okay, except we know that's not true. And
Right. I mean, I think the danger is, I think that is the perspective of authoritarian mindsets,
right, right.
right?
Well, you really pointed this out when you compared grit to the mentality of a rapist. And I
Oh,
wonder
people
if you,
don't like that.
oh, I loved it. I literally read that page and went, oh, chef's kiss. It's a great
Well,
analogy.
but that's what happens, right? Like, again, I think it comes down to limits. We understand grit
Hmm.
because there's been so much great research. And Angela Duckworth took that ball, ran through the goalposts,
Hmm.
and even her ideas about grit have evolved over the
Hmm.
last 10, 12, 15 years. But again, her ideas as a researcher get taken. Once they're out in the world, they don't belong to her anymore, right? They don't belong to researchers anymore. And
Hmm.
so this idea of grit as this personal strength, very valued in military contexts. And so what I
Hmm.
write about is that a lot of that early research was done on military cadets. And the research basically concluded that cadets who could make it through the insane pressure of initiation were
Hmm.
gritty. And they were people who were much more likely to say, I always finish what I begin. And that then became a reference and a definition and an indicator. But the
Hmm.
people who dropped out were considered not gritty.
Hmm.
And a lot of people have taken issue with that, myself included, in that dropping out may be the sign of resilience
Of
because,
resilience.
right, you are like, actually, this is not for me. I need
Hmm.
to make different choices. I have different values.
Hmm.
It's kind of brave to say I'm stopping, right?
Hmm.
I'm forbearing. I'm not going to do that thing. But that didn't count as gritty, right? You could
Hmm.
define gritty in a totally different way. But all the attributes of grittiness also, it turns out, can be applied to a sexually ambiguous encounter that turns into a sexual assault.
Yes.
Because if you set your goal as what you think of as sex, which might
Hmm.
just literally be penetration, forget
Hmm.
anything, right?
Right.
Sex, and you don't give up and you go after what you believe in and you persist through objections and you initiate a situation in which there is a default coercion
Hmm.
or there is fear or silence, and then you end up assaulting someone.
Yeah.
And in fact, your assault of that person confirms your idea of grit.
Right.
And it's
Right.
quite perverse, right? But that is actually not unreasonable in terms of how it could be applied.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, I thought it was a brilliant analogy as someone who has worked with sex offenders
Yeah.
for a long time in my career. There is this attitude of, I will finish what I've started
Mm-hmm.
because if I don't, it means something about my strength, my
Yes.
power, my my organization as a man. And so
Yes.
your coupling of masculinity and grit as a risk to resilience, I think is
Yes.
really spot on, because there is this desire to prove oneself, prove the
Right.
grit, prove one's um, uh, inability to be penetrated or inability to be
Mm-hmm.
wounded, right? And therefore I do the wounding, right?
Yes.
All of that is not resilient. It's quite rigid, actually.
It's
And it,
very rigid.
yeah, and it creates a lot of risk factors for the mental health, of course, of victims and survivors of any
Yes.
kind of assault. But let's take assault out of the equation for a
Mm-hmm.
second and just look at that perniciousness around grit and being
Yes.
impenetrable. that
Yes.
creates for people a lot of risk. And I see those men all the time in my
Hmm.
practice who are struggling. They're depressed, they're anxious, they're more prone to substance use, they're
Yes.
miserable in their relationships because they don't know how to bend with the wind, right? And their perception of resilience is I'm sturdy and therefore I stand straight. But as we know with wind and trees, and I love all of your stories about hurricane in the book, they're
Hmm.
so, I mean, horrific in real life and also
Yes.
beautiful in their metaphor. Um, Trees that don't bend break, and
Right.
that's not resilient.
Right. And I think that one of the dangers we have, to go back to a kind of baseline masculine ideal,
Hmm.
is that still emotions are considered the property of women and girls.
Right.
And the main emotions that boys are taught to emulate as a sign of manhood, the main one is anger,
Hmm.
right? And so a lot of boys, without directly explicit disruptive parenting, shed the ability to feel or recognize sadness, anxiety,
Yeah.
vulnerability, fear, all of these emotions that then get poured into femininity.
Hmm.
Um, and they end up being emotionally incompetent. That is the like they don't have emotional competence. And then
Correct.
you end up with girls and women socialized and for their throughout their lives doing emotional labor and hermeneutic labor and
Hmm.
sort of making up the deficits, and they're much more likely today to no longer do that. You
Hmm.
know, this is why we see the efflorescence of online discussions about these topics, and women are like, no, no,
We're not
no
doing it
more,
anymore.
go sort yourselves out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is then perceived as women are abandoning men, or women
Yes.
are the childless, angry cat ladies, and all the
Yes.
things.
All the things that
Yeah.
they're actively trying to oppress men
Right.
by asking men to please teach themselves how to do these things.
Yeah. And look, as someone who works with a lot of men who do struggle in this space, I know it's really difficult
It's
when
so hard.
it's so hard.
Yeah.
You've grown up your whole life being implicitly and explicitly guided away from your emotional
And punished.
intelligence and punished,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it is really, really scary for a lot of men to step into this space of I don't know what I'm doing, and that's
Hmm.
vulnerable, and then you want me to feel, and that's vulnerable, and then you want me to tell you about it, and that's vulnerable, right? I
Right.
have a lot of heart for how hard that is for men, but it is actually killing our planet for
Well,
them
that's true
when
too. That's right.
when they don't do it, right? It
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, we haven't talked about race, we haven't talked about white
Mhm.
supremacy, but the
Mhm.
layers of these things compound all of these problems.
They
And
do.
so, while we know that men in general are having high levels of loneliness and mental distress, we
Mhm.
also know that young Black men are far less likely to seek out help, are
Right.
far less likely to admit they need help, have high
Mhm.
rates of suicide. And I think it's pretty clear that if you are marginalized in one capacity on the basis of race, for example, you might try to overcompensate in another on
Yes.
the basis of gender.
Mhm.
And so doubling down on a certain ideal of masculinity then is weaponized against you in compounded ways.
Mhm.
And so I think it's just really important to acknowledge the way resilience then becomes that kind of subversively harmful,
Yeah.
again, problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's a quote from your book that really speaks to that. We all live in a system that implicates us in harm to others, but resilience takes thinking about those parts of life in a society that aren't going well and don't make us feel good. Interrogating ourselves and the relationships that we are a part of is essential to our learning to adapt in ways that don't hurt or exploit others.
Right. And I think too that was interesting because you have the stoic man
Yeah.
that right? But then as a kind of corollary to that, you have the ideal of the strong Black woman. who
Mhm.
doesn't get to have all of the attributes of women that white
Right.
women do, the
Yeah.
fragility or the softness or the weakness, however you want to categorize it. And
Mhm.
they're just expected to absorb and absorb and absorb and to carry and
Mhm.
carry and carry and to be resilient for everyone around them,
Mhm.
you know? And so you have that gendered aspect of resilient care
Mhm.
married to the more brutalizing racial aspects
Yeah.
of resilient expectations.
Yeah. How do you recommend people start making sense of all of the layers of these expectations on them, and also trying to understand how to show up from a place of, I'll use your language in the book, resonance, right, in
Hmm.
their resilience?
You know, it's so complicated, right? And in fact, it can feel so overwhelming because when you really start looking at it, it's just layer on layer and layer.
Mhm.
But I think that that also can be liberating because then you
Mhm.
really realize I can only do so much,
Yeah.
right? I can do what I can in my place, in my
Mhm.
home, in my community, but then I have to do other things, right?
Mm.
I have to open space for people who don't have it. If I have certain privileges, how can I distribute them?
Mhm.
Um, how can I develop resilience, in fact, to the worldview I inherited? Because
Mhm.
that's the problem for all of us, right? We inherited a worldview. It's so totalitarian and complete most of the time that we
Mhm.
don't step back and say, well, wait, what? You
Yeah.
know? And so I think we see a lot more of that happening now.
Mm.
And I've spent a great deal of time in my career fighting badness on the internet, so
Mm.
I understand how bad it is. But you
Yeah.
have to give credit too to the technology for shifting the landscape and allowing so many more people to
Mhm.
share their experiences, to talk to each other,
Mhm.
to gain insights into communities they never would have been exposed to before.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of value in that, you know? And so I think one thing is just this is such an overused word, but I think that starting from a point of compassion and self compassion when it comes to resilience is
Mhm.
thinking through am I being hard on myself and others? Why am I doing it?
Mm.
Why am I insisting that my child just persist till to the point of exhaustion?
Yeah.
Right? What is that? What am I teaching them? Am I teaching them to work themselves to death over the course of their lives? Like
Mm.
what is the message that I'm conveying when I model that behavior, right?
Mhm.
And you mentioned resonance and there's a lot of the book that I try and dedicate to dismantling binaries.
Mhm.
So we inherited this very dualistic
Mhm.
worldview, and we see it everywhere. We've got mind body, we've got male female, we have black white, we have man versus nature.
Mhm.
And resonance, I think, comes from the idea that we need to break that thinking up
Mhm.
and then we need to try and connect things. So
Yeah.
when you connect, you have resonance.
Mhm.
And one of the biggest, I think, misunderstood and under-resourced resilience resources we have, of course, is nature
Yeah.
and understanding our relationship to our environments, like really
Mhm.
embodied, not just a kind of mind-based, oh, I love nature, but the
Mhm.
embodied interactions that we have
Mm.
with our environments, for better or for worse.
Mhm. Can you say a little bit more about how people might really cultivate that awareness, that embodied awareness of
Mhm.
their environments?
So, I think first of all, that like in the chapter 2 of the book, I talk a lot about how detached we are taught to become from our
Mhm.
bodies,
Mhm.
how we live in a culture that denigrates our material needs, and that in fact to be needy as a human being is contemptible to many
Mm.
people, right?
Mhm.
And yet it is our need that is a source of resilience because we
Mhm.
take care of each other. That's how we evolved to survive.
Mhm.
But we don't think that way, generally speaking, and we definitely don't think that way in terms of our environments. It's why we
Mhm.
have a climate disaster.
Mhm.
It's why we have environmental injustice and toxicity. It's why we have entire corporations poisoning our water and food,
Mhm.
and yet we feel helpless in the face of stopping it, right? And so I think that well, first of all, infinite ways to do that, right? Like
Mhm.
literally just going for a walk
Mhm.
helps people
Mhm.
feel better about life.
Mhm.
Everyone can go for a walk, but then you think, well, where am I going to go for a walk?
Yeah.
And then you understand really the profoundness of social injustice, right? I
Mm.
live in a neighborhood, you see, where there are trees. If I
Yeah.
drive 4 miles away, I'm in a neighborhood where there are no trees,
Yeah.
right? And that matters. Like, how can I in my community change that, right?
Mhm.
What can I do to say it's really important that everyone has access to nature, for
Yeah.
example?
Yeah.
And you might not think of that as a way to build resilience, but it is absolutely a way to build resilience.
Mm. I agree, in large part because I think resilience is also about being generative when you have the
Hmm.
capacity to be generative. So, right, like we all sort of live in this fluidity of need and have and give and receive. And I
Hmm.
think there's something really important about when you feel restored, when you feel resourced, can you look around and say, wow, what can I do to enhance the
Yes.
environment, the experience of other people? How can I nurture
Hmm.
the world in a way that I have felt nurtured? Coming back to that quote, we are nurtured in spaces that we nurture,
Right.
right? So if we are looking around and saying there aren't enough trees in this neighborhood, what can I do to change? And creating some community, maybe a coalition to get some plants
Hmm.
created or a garden planted somewhere in the space can bring
Right.
such a ripple effect of heartfelt resonance with nature, with community,
That's right.
and sort of the reverberation of being in community, right? We don't just, as islands, come into a community, plant a tree, and leave,
And leave. That's right.
right?
That's right. And I think too, this is one of the things that so many people misunderstand about the prison abolition movement,
Mm,
right? It's first of all, you would have to immerse yourself really, which I think is important for people to do
geez. Yeah.
in understanding that movement.
Mm,
But one of the key issues is that because we don't care, we don't have communities that are nurturing,
yeah.
we don't have caring societies, because we criminalize everything in lieu
Everything.
everything in lieu of saying, how can we help this person?
Mm-hmm.
This person is in dire need. This person should never have been in this
Mm-hmm.
situation to
Mm-hmm.
begin with, but here we are.
Yeah.
We build more prisons,
Mm-hmm.
and if you are a member of a community that's been eviscerated over generations
Mm,
by this carelessness, what are you going to do?
yeah.
But you understand the root of the problem so profoundly, so intimately, and
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to change it. And what you get from other communities is a kind of dumbfounded, what?
Yeah.
You know, which again, I know it's an oversimplification, but it is such a carelessness.
It
It's not,
is.
let me listen, let me learn.
Yeah, I can't remember what part of the book you talked about this in, but my takeaway was that we stop thinking about ourselves as interconnected when
Mm.
there's motivation to distance oneself, right? And
Hmm.
so, as a psychologist, I think a lot about disgust and how
Yes.
powerful the emotion of disgust is. And I talk about it a lot as it relates to sex, but it also relates to resilience. And
Yes, absolutely.
when we have to make ourselves feel better,
Hmm. Safer.
superior, safer, right?
Right.
All of these sort of distancing strategies from what we
Right.
identify as a problem, when the problem, and I'm putting that in quotes for people
Yeah,
listening, is a group of people, right? In this case, prisoners, we'll say,
that's right. Or
right?
immigrants.
Or immigrants,
Right.
or whomever is othered, right? Trans
Hmm.
people. When
Yes.
we make a group of people an other, and then we distance ourselves from them in order to protect our self-concept, or
Hmm.
feel like, wow, I'm absolved of the contribution to whatever makes a
That's
problem
right.
in
I'm not
society.
implicated.
Right. Right. I'm
Right.
safe. I didn't do it. I didn't cause it. I don't have to fix it. And that really is such a reductionistic way of thinking and a
Right.
myopic way of thinking that does not really take into consideration the holistic implications of how we all exist in groups. We all exist in community.
Right. And I will say that, so much of our resilience ideologies are mind-based,
Mm-hmm.
right? We know this.
Mm-hmm.
think of the list, right? There's this nebulous strength, there's optimism, there's mental toughness, there's
Mhm.
the quality of being hardy, of persevering. You know, anyone can learn to be resilient if you just take these habits of mind and you hone them,
Mhm.
right? And again, I don't think you can say this enough. When you pour this idea constantly just into the mind,
Mhm.
then it's so much easier to decouple from the body.
Yeah.
And once you decouple from the body, it's so much easier to brutalize it, your own body or the bodies of others. And
Mm.
when you then combine that with contempt, disgust, fear, all of
Mhm.
those emotions, then you end up putting children in cages
Hugely.
and chasing men on horseback with dogs. I mean, you just lose any sense of humanity, not
Yeah.
just in other people, but in yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
hesitate to use the word humanity because I want to emphasize in the book the more than human world, right?
Mm.
Animals, plants,
Yes.
the atmosphere. Like, you just, if you can appreciate how interconnected we are,
Mhm.
then you can really understand, again, the richness of
Mhm.
how we might choose to be resilient.
Yeah. Well, in our final moments, I'm curious, what would you say to any listeners who are hearing this and maybe thinking about it differently for the first time and still recognizing in them a little bit of a defensive or a distancing response to what we're talking about? What would you like them to leave with?
You know, I say this because it's sort of a summary of what we've talked about.
Mhm.
But I think one of the most important things to consider is the way we think of resilience as strength and the opposite of resilience is weakness or
Mm.
vulnerability.
Mm.
You ask 20 people, and if you say, what's the opposite of resilience? They might say fragility, dependence, because
Mm.
self-sufficiency, you know, all of these things. But I think the takeaway really is that the opposite of resilience in this way that we're discussing is loneliness.
Yeah.
It is the profound isolation of a human being from other people, from their environment, from
Mm.
feeling a sense of worth or purpose or connection.
Mhm.
And it is really the most, like as an individual,
Mhm.
it is the most anti-resilient thing that can happen to feel that loneliness,
Mm. Yeah.
you know? And so I think it's making a shift, a paradigm shift between our very socially cultivated individualism, the
Mhm.
power of the individual,
Mhm.
and thinking instead of resilience relationally.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. Clinically, it reminds me of the difference between compartmentalization and integration, which is often
Mm-hmm.
what we're looking at as trauma focused providers, right? We want to
Mm-hmm.
help people move from this fragmented experience of themselves, this
Right.
compartmentalized, no parts know each other version of themselves, to one that is really a lot more integrated. And that is, from an internal systems perspective, more relational. And what
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing you say is that if we extrapolate that out into the
Yeah.
world, right, we are not islands. And
No, we're
so
not.
so resilience really is about creating a relational approach to healing and being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a
Thank
great
you.
conversation.
Yes, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this today.
Of course, of course. Where can people learn more about your work or what you're working on
Mm-hmm.
next?
So, my books are available wherever you buy books, hopefully a local bookstore. But I also tend to post anything I write or conversations like this in Instagram. I have a Rage and Resilience account, and I also have my own personal name account, Soraya Chemaly, and Twitter and Facebook. There's so many other social media, like I could list them all, but basically, if you look up my name on a platform, you'll find it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you again. I'm so
Thank
grateful that
you.
you took the time to have this
Oh,
conversation.
thank you. Yes, me too. I'm happy that we had a chance to do it.
Me too. And thanks everyone for listening. I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and on YouTube at Modern Intimacy. If you have questions you want answered on the podcast, feel free to email me at question at getnakedpodcast.com. Our Modern Intimacy team is here to help you and to provide you with support. Feel free to schedule a free 30-minute consultation at the link in our show notes. And don't forget to join our newsletter for insights, surveys, and articles sent directly to your inbox. You can sign up at modernintimacy.com/newsletter. New episodes drop every Tuesday. I'll see you next week. Disclaimer: this podcast is not a substitute for therapy and does not constitute a professional relationship with me, Dr. Kate, or with Modern Intimacy. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only.